All right, hi. I'm Flo. I'm, as said, from Still Life Studios, and this title here, as it already suggests, why many educational games are not fun, kind of sets a little bit of the tone that I think they are not fun, or that because we're talking about education, that learning is not fun. And we're going to take a look into that today, because I think it's something that a lot of games nowadays are a bit scared of. It's about overwhelming somebody with some information, especially, and whatnot. Yeah, as already said, I'm a game designer. This is our studio, and kind of had the trouble of not knowing, like, should I put my name only on the title slide, or also on the one where I say what I do, and so it's on both. And when I do something like this, like switching, especially at the beginning, like back and forth, and we don't go linear through it, that actually has an effect on you that we'll talk about later as well. But first of all, what kind of stuff are we doing? Because it's very much related to what we're talking about today. This is our studio. We're living in the mountains, pretty much, in Austria. And we're doing a lot of these games where we're talking tycoon, where we're talking simulation and management. So stuff where there's a lot to figure out for a player, usually. And that is especially for us a challenge in the beginning when they start playing. And also later on, because, well, games that carry a lot of information always need some time to explain something and whatnot. And there's always the chance that, well, you can be overwhelmed with it. And while this is not necessarily educational games, this is actually something that we kind of share with those kind of games. Why we're specifically also talking about education here is something I'll get to quite soon. But related to our studio, there's this one kind of question that also inspired speaking about this today of one of our game directors, and that was, what did your players learn? And it's not like that he's coming to me when I'm sitting on my desk and asking me, Flo, what do your players learn? Because it's not a question you ask like this. But he asked it actually to himself and gave a talk eventually about this, and talked about that the kind of games you're doing, those games where you simulate something, where you manage something, they have this potential of, well, that you can learn something from that. That's not just the game itself, but actually some knowledge that affects our world, that you can maybe even apply outside or talk about it, and it's relevant to the actual real world. Yeah, which kind of inspired me then doing this. And what's an additional thing about me where this question really got my, I'd say, my cogwheels turning was, during my education, that was very digital art related. We had a thing going that was sort of, I call it teaching as a hobby. It was called Creative Meetup. We were gathering together once a week to talk about some stuff, how we do certain things, especially art related things in the digital space, like, I don't know, color scripts and whatnot. And therefore, if somebody asks me, hey, or shows me that we have opportunity, that we can also teach something with our mainly entertainment products, right? Because at the end of the day, we're not doing educational games, but there's learning opportunity, then I'm starting to get kind of active. And what I also did on the side at times is that I'm quite involved, or used to be quite involved in the startup community in Austria, and worked with a young startup called Sparks, and then a very, very young one recently I'm talking to is called Konomondo. They're actually doing educational games, at least the second one. The first one is more about gamification. And yeah, that was quite interesting to also get their kind of approaches on this going, and I got a lot of input when thinking about how can we make people learn. From people who actually have the task to learn, because that's where our games kind of differ. One learns first and one kind of plays first. And that's the first interesting thing to talk about, what's the difference between the main focus on the fun or the main focus on the learning. And what I find particularly interesting is, while a lot of people like to say, well, they like to learn when they get older, it's usually, if you think about educational games, they pop up in a context where people actually struggle to learn, where they don't really want to learn. We have to make it fun. That's why it's an educational game, right? But then there's a metaphor that came to my mind, which is about French toast, which is like, okay, there is actually a meal, and we, as games that are mainly entertainment products, are kind of the dessert at least in my opinion. We're the thing that after you did your main dish, after you're done with your day, you come and then, enjoying your sweets. But then when it's about French toast, all of a sudden it's a sweet thing where people sometimes add bacon and even butter and so on. So it's kind of both, and it still kind of works, and it's actually great. So there is actually sometimes opportunity to combine things that feel like a little bit detached from each other. And so first question to ask is, okay, what is fun? And the thing is, and I think, are there some designers in the room? Like, yeah? You probably heard these discussions quite a bunch of times, especially if there are multiple designers in the room, they like to discuss what fun is. But I don't know, at some point I started to kind of don't like it anymore, because this is just a discussion that gives you a headache, and eventually it does not go anywhere. And especially in the context of this talk today, the lot more interesting question to ask is, okay, what is not fun? And now that you heard me talk a bunch of times and considering the title and whatnot, you could think that, okay, now what I'm after of what could be not fun is, well, learning. And then it kind of depends. A lot of you probably think about themselves as someone who likes to learn, right? But there is a bunch of things, and as said, with the existence of educational games, they kind of imply that there needs to be something gamified in order that people have an easier time learning, because for some reason they don't want to do it just like that. So let's see, what are actually the kind of reasons of things of what is not fun, and let's see if it applies to learning. Well, the one thing when I think about video games that are not fun is they are very linear, and they are very, very limiting. So I go through a straight path, and I can't do a lot of stuff. That's the worst thing you can give to me. In terms of fun, I like to plan stuff. I like to figure out, okay, I go here first to this, and I go here first to that. And then while this is evolving along the time, I kind of start to forget myself. If a good open world game is doing that, I go here and I go there, and when I was there, there's 15 other things I could do now. And that's what fun is, in my opinion. So the opposite of that is kind of this limiting space, sort of. And then also two important parts, the overload and the underload. And especially the overload is quite an interesting thing. Are there people who have like a Steam library here or something where they have a bunch of games they are like, I will play this someday, but you just don't? Yeah? And that's interesting, right? Because I would argue, and maybe some of you agree on that the main reason why we don't start those games is that we feel like, probably I already checked on how long to beat, how long it takes to beat them, and it's quite long, so it's probably tedious to get into the game. So there's a lot of learning you need to do to get into this game, right? And for some reason you just don't start it, or that's actually exactly the reason why I don't start it. So even though some people say, hey, especially when we get older, we enjoy learning, we like learning, there's this overload at times. As said, when we already had the dessert, we don't care about this thing from before where we had to put more energy into. We don't want to be bothered after our workday with learning all this stuff. All right, so yeah, why learning? Let's just have fun. And as I already touched on it before, it's just having fun leaves us then to just consume games that are really super accessible and will always stay like that, and they can't go beyond that. And even for those games, every game sort of has its onboarding phase and its tutorial phase where we have to learn some stuff. Even it's the most straightforward mobile game where I just need to use one finger to do something, I kind of have to learn it, right? So it's an integral part of interaction. And on the other hand, there's also this thing inside of me and inside of a bunch of you as well that says, yeah, but I like learning. And if you're scrolling on social media around for a little bit in your feed, there's a bunch of people where you probably read like, yeah, I like learning. And you read it in a LinkedIn comment or in a post, and they tell you about why learning is so great. And it's like, yeah, we know, right? But as a kid, can get kind of hard to get into learning, right? And that's why these terms like educational games exist, or learning games, or whatever. Because yeah, let's add this other part, this fun part to it, and then they will eventually do the learning, right? And so let's see there's those different approaches for a second. Like that, one approach is that there's focus on the play, as said, and one there's this focus on the learn, and where the fun actually becomes secondary. Because the interesting thing that I sort of noticed or figured out, especially also when organizing this knowledge for some time, was that it sometimes makes a game more fun when there are times where fun becomes secondary, so you can figure something out. Oh yeah. And that has a lot of to do with how we think. And if you don't take anything away from today's talk, by the way, it's probably this slide is the best one. It's actually something I talked with those people who do educational games by themselves, and they say they know a lot about didactics and whatnot. And interesting for me, having games at hand where you can actually deliver something to learn, this is quite interesting, and I think it's quite interesting in general for design and for every kind of game you do, even like the simplest one, is how people like to think, and also where the potential is of how we can think. And it's kind of split into systems. System one is like fast, instinctive, emotional. It's exactly this kind of system that's most active after you're done with your workday, and somebody tries to explain a game to you, but you really can't listen to the rules, because it's kind of hard to get into system two. It's this slow, deliberative, logical thing that requires a lot of energy. But the more accustomed we get to something we're doing, let's say a move in chess, if I'm a very good chess player, I'm mainly in system one, even if I play chess, even though it's a game where you have to think a lot. So that kind of means that, well, we kind of like the idea of mastering something, and getting it into the first system that we then casually use. And to do that, we have to go into second system. And as a kid, that's just kind of harder. We tend to be most of the time in the first system. And as soon as we grow older, especially when we get jobs, what we can see is when there's something to learn, is we know we can immediately apply it to our job, for example. Usually, people love then to learn when what they're learning is kind of part of what they're doing for their profession, and they see already, this has so much potential that during my workday I can use this like this, and that, because I learned that. And then the idea kind of is, hey, if I learned that, I have this in my system one, sort of, and therefore I go into system two, and then I have an easier time later on. And I enjoy this idea of being there, and so I learn, and then it becomes kind of exciting. And so we can also look into learnifying the game, because it works on the same principle. Or it can add fun in the same principle. It's like this moment where you're looking forward to have this in your first system ready whenever you need it, can also be done in a game, right? You embrace that there is this thing for you to figure out that then enhances actually your gameplay, because you know it then. And that's actually the opposite is a problem to look into, because there are some games, especially when it comes to bigger productions, and we are mainly focused on PC and console games, where there's a certain amount of hours we kind of strive for our players to get out of this, right? And if there's nothing new for them to figure out later, to learn for them later on, then it can be stagnated. Yeah, sure, we can increase the numbers, we can ask for more and whatnot, but as long as there's nothing new I can have to wrap my head around, then it starts to become kind of boring, starts to become kind of the job where you never look forward to learning something new that you can then apply, because you just have the kind of job where you can't apply new learnings because it's very linear and so on. And then we're not looking so much forward to learning, or in this case then we're not looking so much forward into continuing this game, and we stop before we reach, well, the credits or something like that. We go into some examples. I chose the order of them quite deliberate in terms of where where do we need to apply this? Where can we apply it? And what is kind of the course of how much learning we put onto a player when they go through a game, assuming it is a little bit of a longer game, but even for shorter ones. And the first one is the thing where we all kind of need to learn in a video game. It's exactly the thing I pointed out before. That's why you're not starting this one Steam game, even though you know it's so awesome, right? Because onboarding takes time. It is actually something where you need to learn, right? And an even better example, and my favorite example, is board games and card games, where I think there's two board and card game people in the world, and there's the one who loves to explain the rules, and there's the other one who hates to listen to the rules, right? And main reason for that, same kind of thing as before with the system thinking. One who already knows the game, is already fully into it, doesn't have a hard time to talk about it, but you, after a workday, somebody tries to teach you a board game, and you need to go in this second system where it's just harder to be in. You tend to and you're already done. You've been so long in this system today, right? Because you had to use it during work. Don't bother me with all these rules, right? And then you're not listening to it, and ultimately it could be that you end up not playing the game. And the interesting thing is, some onboardings we do in video games tend to be the same. And the fun part of it is, because it is a learning procedure that we're all aware of in the game, where we just need to narrow down and figure one thing out after the other, it's exactly how we're designing it. I don't know if there are some designers in the room who did like longer onboardings for their game and had to design it at one point, or just general indies or creatives who do all stuff in their games. But it even happened to me, and maybe it also happened to you, that you're designing the most linear onboarding, and you show it to someone, and they tell you, "Oh, this is super boring." How did it even happen that you designed this linear onboarding? And I think the answer is that there's this idea about learning that, like, we're going through the steps, it's explaining the board game, and then we can finally have fun, we can finally play, but the question is, do we even get to there, or do they already uninstall your game beforehand, right? And there are better ways to onboard things. We do it over time. It's something we've been exposed to a lot, right? As I said, we're doing some games that have a certain complexity to it. To give you an example, this is the cockpit of a bus in one of the cockpits, let's say, in one of our release games. And there's these two kind of players, especially at the beginning of the game you have to deal with. There's this one person that wants to press all the buttons because they're kind of into this topic, they're into vehicles, and they kind of know what it should do, so they better all work, and they better all do a thing, and they better do the thing they should do. And then there's the other people who just want to sit down after an evening, or in their evening, after a long day of work, and I don't know, I hope the game kind of shows me by itself how it works. I hope we don't have to go through this explaining phase of the board game, right? And I can just play, and I can just have fun. And however, eventually, we want to actually get to a point where kind of both of them embrace the same things, because the later on challenges, they will become sort of demanding. We have to take care of the one side not become bored from, well, making the game too limited, so we don't have to make a complex onboarding, because the game is limited anyways. And then there's one side of the people who doesn't want to play it anymore, or make it too complex to have every button working and doing the thing it does, and all of a sudden you press the emergency stop, and then nothing works anymore, and you press another button, and you're wondering, why is this thing not moving? It's frustrating for the other side. But as already touched on it, there comes this point, and I think this is ultimately to answer this question of our director as well, what did your players learn, is I think we can get to a point where it becomes to be about mastery and expertise. And what I mean with that is that at some point in a game, especially in games, you tend to play very long, and I said it's usually games we tend to work on that should have a longer playtime. There comes a point where it can become kind of boring if the game does not introduce something new for you to learn. And on the one side, this can be about button presses and whatnot, but a fascinating example where they actually found a way to not just well, expand on your knowledge that you then use in the game to play the game, but also actually giving you something to learn that is just interesting knowledge in the real world is what they did here. Not a game pass, but this is a screen in Age of Empires 4, where it's sort of a mission screen, and it has these unlockables here. And I find this fascinating. This is, I think, it shows where a game can go in terms of what it can teach you if it is engaging. Because there's things you want to unlock that are videos and stuff to read, pretty much the opposite what you do in a game. Usually people tend to complain a lot about cutscenes. They tend to complain a lot about heavy reading sections. And here it's actually a reward. And the interesting part about it is that I think it adds this mental modeling that a game can have. When you tell something about a game, there's this chance that it sounds more exciting than it actually is in the end when the people play the game. I think you all ran into this situation where you've been really excited about a game, you tell a friend about it, your friend tries it out, and your friend is like, I don't know. But this adds the mental modeling for you, because you know now after watching this video how this kind of crossbow works from this nation during this amount of this time, and then you have the people using this stuff that you command around, and you have all this context to it. All of a sudden, it becomes way more exciting. There's new stuff for you to think about, and new stuff that you had to learn to think about it that makes the ongoing experience, again, more and more exciting, and you keep wanting to play the game, and all of a sudden, these things become again interesting, because I can look ahead, similar to the learning something for your job. I can look ahead to take these things that I don't know yet, that I need to digest, where I have to think a little bit deliberate and logical, eventually establish them into System 1, and then just playing the game, and while I'm being aware of these things, I'm having more fun about it, because I can be the master of this game. I'm the expert. I can explain someone what this is, and become a history expert at the same time. And I mean, not term expert is a bit questionable, right? But I can get very educated about it, which is nice. And then if people ask you, well, how do you know all about that stuff? Well, actually not from reading books or from watching documentaries. I play a bunch of Age of Empires, which is very cool. All right, this is actually the final section of this presentation. Don't add me on the title. I'm very weird with titles at times, but the same principle of these systems and how the learning from the onboarding, where it's a pain, to the learning from later on the game, where it's actually amazing, is also something we kind of need to be aware of when we're working in design. And what I mean by that is, well, as I said before, we have an onboarding. We tend to design onboardings. We tend to think about learning in onboardings, that you learn the game. And then all of a sudden we design the most linear thing, which is weird, because that's our idea about learning. And so it's kind of a limiting view that we don't think about when designing games. And the main reason why I think that is because I think during game productions, especially during long, bigger projects, we're trimming down a lot. And what I mean by that is there's a chance that very complex games become out of hand, that there's the scale, feature creep, and whatnot. And therefore, we have our game pillars. We define our intents for every feature. So you most definitely can be sure that, well, this fits into this game. We carefully decide what goes in, so we don't feature creep. So it is an experience that makes sense. And, well, when we then think about, okay, while this is kind of our go-to process of thinking, also kind of means, okay, this is our System 1 way of approaching things when working, right? We have our game pillars, they are our tools, we try to prove our features against them. We're kind of the lawyer of our feature, and the game director is the judge, and we carefully put one feature after the other in. We come to the point where we need to do an onboarding, or where we want to expand our game by actually adding static knowledge to it, and all of a sudden it's a value. It's stuff we don't really think about, right? Because we're kind of stuck into our own System 1. But there's actually a design way of thinking to get a little bit out of this. That's why I put the first term on the slide, that we converge a lot. It's a principle of design thinking where it's first about diverging and then about converging, right? You look into what opportunities you have, and then you narrow down again. And sometimes I think even during productions, we just have to make ourselves aware of this, that even not just our players are in these, bouncing around between these systems, it's also us designers ourselves, or in general developers. So we kind of should also consider here and there, open up again, think about, okay, what is the potential of this game pillar? Where could it go? I'm not sure if the people who did Age of Empires 4 had the idea that, yeah, we're doing video footage and stuff as rewards in the game at the beginning. At some point, you kind of ask the question, hey, this game is not done, it's a working loop, it is fun, all cool. Question is, but then you realize, okay, after 20 hours, it's kind of not fun, or realize in the onboarding, players don't get that, maybe let's remove that. Yeah, but maybe, I don't know, maybe we can reintroduce it later on because it's part of the progression for this and that sense, and kind of get ourselves out a little bit of this systematic thinking. And that can ultimately also, I think, design a game that gets out of where you're not stuck in system one, and where you can eventually come to a point where players actually seek knowledge and seek something new to unlock that they learn from. Because, yeah, I said, I think we designers are exactly the same as the people. We're stuck in this one system sometimes, don't want to get out of it, but can actually ultimately make a better game by getting out of it. So to recap a bit, this is it's not exactly the title of the presentation, but kind of the title of the presentation, but I feel like obligated to answer this question. Funny enough, even though I called the presentation like this, I don't think that educational games are not fun. It's just that I think they have a bad rep on them, and that's a cool conclusion to have, as a cool thing to think about when designing a game is, why does this term even exist that suggests that there's a game, you know what a game is, you know what education is, and why do we need to combine it, especially if we consider how fun learning is, why do we even need to combine it, right? And it's just because, well, there's especially young audiences have a harder time into engaging in the learning process, so, and it's therefore more challenging to get into this state of the late game where you like learning. It's like a video game is like going through, kind of over-philosophical maybe, but it's like this micro version of life, where at the beginning, it's like, I don't know, too much stuff to figure out. It's like when you sit in school and you don't want to listen to this math lecture. And then at the end, it's like, I love learning, right? I love to learn. This is cool stuff, and I want to look into this stuff. I want to look into how I improve my cooking. It's the same, kind of the same principle, and that's why these games ultimately exist. There's just a point in time where this is the bigger challenge, and I think it's quite novel to tackle it, actually. And to go to the subtitle of the whole thing, what to learn from that, I hope you paid a little bit of attention during this presentation, then, because it is all that was in there pretty much, but to really wrap it up in hopefully as clever of a way as I imagine it is. Learning isn't fun until it is, and playing is fun until it isn't. And that's kind of the exact point where we as designers and developers need to think, hey, there's a point where I need to demand something from you so you actually keep being excited, because that's ultimately at some point what you want. And then we do the fun part again. Then we do the system one part again, right? And then we add on this, and this is how a game ultimately becomes harder and grows in itself. And why is that the case? Yeah, well, because we love to think fast. We don't want to listen to your board game rules in the evening, because that is slow thinking. But we also want to be smart, right? If you can explain your board game into a way like some games do elegant onboarding, then I can be smart about it, then I can be good at it. And if you're like me, I hate listening to rules. But as soon as I figured out the game, I get very competitive. And that's kind of the same principle, right? Even though at the one side it seems like you don't want to engage, you actually want to engage. But there's just this threshold that we have to figure out. All right, that's overall, I think, the talk. I just feel like I want to do some acknowledgement to the guys from Conomundo, like the people I talk about that actually do educational games, because it's like some interesting insights to convince you to do something is also something we can use in games that are mainly entertainment products. Also my studio, because there's actually this, I think it's cool that our game directors ask these kind of questions. It makes me feel like, hey, we can look into adding some value. That's the next big thing, right? Adding value to games, aside from them actually being fun, is a cool thing. Not saying every game needs to have that. Like I'm, for example, also a quite competitive Tetris 99 player. Competitive not in the sense of I'm doing tournaments, but I get to be engaged in it heavily. And I don't expect this game to educate me on anything, right? But if your game has the opportunity, if it is reasonably complex and attached to something where there's knowledge on, well then try to communicate it. I think that's cool. And last but not least, thanks to the DevGAMM people for having me. It was nice to be here. Thanks. Thank you everyone for listening. At the end, I'll leave you with this picture of showing that, yeah, well, fresh sauce is actually a cool thing, right? Even though it's salty and sweet. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your beautiful presentation. I want to ask if the audience has any questions. If you have a question, raise your hand. Okay, a couple of questions.
I'll actually spare you this because you all are probably very hungry, right? Can I? Well, wonderful.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. It was great.
Hi.
I'm a playable art developer, so I create these small games, like ads. So the user who probably 50% don't want to play on this game, I need to show this tutorial, this overboarding, like in 30 seconds and gameplay. So it's no problem when is it a very small game, like only taps. We probably show only like this hand tutorial. The problem is when the game is fun, when you know, for example, 2 types of moves, and how you will advise me to proceed with this kind of overboard, how to say, onboarding of the game.
You mean if the game would be more complex, how to approach it?
So the fun is when you know, for example, jumping and movies, and you need to provide moving and jumping and maybe firing. So lots of steps, and you need to provide it in 30 seconds. And even give time to play for this user. Yeah, I mean there are multiple approaches. One, I think that's quite popular nowadays, and I think is a very cool approach. But that it depends on your game if it works. Is if there are multiple features and while they might be combined with each other and make sense with each other to get to a bigger goal in the end, they might function all on its own. And then what's cool in onboarding is if you just give me a sandbox to move around in, and then as soon as I'm trying to interact with this thing because it looks fancy, then you explain the thing to me, right? You don't get me through the path, place the things, and then say, this is this, this is that. Give me the entire space. I look around and say, here's a thing. I go to that and say, and then you tell me, hey, this is how you interact with it. That's the one thing I can intuitively think about. The other one is like to just look at the most classic examples, I would say, where you just show the player, or leave them to their own consequences, more or less. You can do this in let's say, in a not so painful way, in a not so punishing way. And the prime example is one of the first video games that a lot of people play. It is like in the first Mario game, you have this pit, right? But there's no hole. You can land on the ground. And okay, I figured out, okay, this is how much I need to get over the pit. All right, next jump, I figured it out, right? Or you can do it super painful and just, have them figure out the mechanic. If they fail, well, they failed. They try again. You don't have to be so nice to them. This is what I'm trying to say. Because then also I don't feel like you're holding my hand all the time. If you need to give me a static corridor, well then, I don't know, give me some emotions at least, right? In System 1, we are emotional, right? And then it could also work really well.
I think that this topic is very important because I read that book that you were talking about, like the first system and second.
I have to admit, I actually didn't. I only read up on the topic.
Nice.
Because those people from the educational games had educated me about this. So I read a bunch of stuff about it, but not the entire thing. But cool stuff.
Yeah, I got it. It's absolutely perfect, and I think that in games, I had a question personally, so my question is like, for a couple of months, I've been seeing that kids love games, right? They play them all the time. They like Minecraft and stuff and other games, and they get into hard games really quickly. And I was like thinking, why am I so like lame? I'm lazy. I don't want to learn rules, as you said, about board games. And I saw that they don't seek. They seek for fun by learning, but not by pulling the hand, as you said. If you take a person by the hand and you start to educate them, and they see that this is an educational process, and I don't want to be educated, I want to learn. So, is there a trick that you can like share, maybe, or give some examples where you are educating a player, but you are not showing him that you are educating him? You're like giving them rules, but in some sophisticated way that he thinks that he learns it by himself.
I think that is actually what a lot of successful games are doing, yes. So yeah, I think there is a way. Can I come up with an example real quick?
Well, maybe a trick, not an example. It's really hard, I guess, to pull it out.
Yeah, but I'm not sure if there's a universal trick. I think you have to look at it sort of mechanic by mechanic, or chain of mechanic by chain of mechanics. It really depends. But,
Sorry for that.
I mean, it's an interesting question. Yeah, it's something you think a lot about. It's like, because that's what good games tend to give us as a feeling. We feel like as a champion when we're conquering the game, even though, and as designers, there's this meme of, well, players think that they are so smart, but it's actually we making them feel smart. It's the thing, right? So it is something in general quite common. I think what could be some sort of rule to apply here is, if you taught me a mechanic, let me play around with it, but maybe also give me additionally the opportunity to explore the next one. So, okay, let's say I've learned how I'm, I don't know, watering plants in Stardew Valley. Okay, and so I kind of know, okay, this is how I do this, and then the game shows me how I can do it better, and all of a sudden we have this simple chain already going, right? Okay, I'm doing this, I'm working in for this upgrade, I get this upgrade, it's like, I'm so good. And then it goes beyond that. We go into the automation of stuff, right? Okay, and all of a sudden I can place things that do it by its own, because at some point I get bored, so I need some opportunity to upgrade. And as long as I see this opportunity to upgrade, and I can work towards it, I'm always feeling like pretty great, because I'm doing the next smartest thing. Right? I'm working towards the next one, and then I have it, and all of a sudden the game says, yeah, by the way, there's also the bigger one for automating stuff, right? And then you work towards that.
Okay, great. Thank you for this answer. We have like room for one more question. Okay. Sorry for that.
Thank you very much. The previous question was actually very related to the one that I was going to ask, because it seems to me that this education stuff, this learning process is very subtle thing. I have a feeling that a lot of games actually miss the opportunity to support the growth of the players, also not only providing the fun, but as you thought about these two modes of things, to me it's philosophically it's like two sides of the coin. So actually flipping it around in the correct moments, it's the way to go. But I think balancing this is the issue.
You think, sorry?
That balancing this is the issue sometimes.
Yeah, this is mastery. Yeah, that's something we struggle with every day when making games, I think.
Yeah. Do you have any tricks on that? Because also it's the different styles of learning that people have psychologically. I'm more aligned with what you said. I like to forget everything and just push the button and see what happens. So it's also difficult to address that. So do you have any tricks on that?
But as you said, that you're also this kind of person that likes this. It's kind of the thing I tried to touch on in the end of the presentation, and it's something that's so hard to get across because it's so abstract. I don't have any tip, because I think it really depends on the situation and on the specific problem you're accounting. Because in the moment of a of coming across this problem, it's not necessarily that you know, oh, by the way, this is probably a point where we need to give the player some new stuff to figure out. It's just like you just know something's not working, right? And then, yeah, it's just about sitting down and maybe doing the diverge stuff again. It's like, okay, what could it all be, right? Let's forget our straightforward process of how we add features and how we verify them, and think a little bit maybe, are there other ways to figure out what's the actual problem, right? Are there other design process we can look into and other verification models, and just make sure you're not getting stuck in your own loop, so you figure out what's the problem of the loop you're creating. That's really a situation-to-situation thing to figure out, just to have the mental model ready to try to tackle it.
Thank you very much. And it's actually a fun thing to figure these things out. So maybe it's a good thing that it's a situation actually. Keeps us moving.
That's why we need humans to make games, at least for now. Right?
Right. Thank you very much.
Another question? The last one. Okay, guys, sorry.
Okay. So I noticed that most of the games you were showing were more aimed for older audience, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I also noticed that we have a decline in the genre of educational games for children. Do you think that with the modern knowledge about how to make educational games fun, will we see some kind of rise of the genre? Because now games targeted for kids are Fortnite, Minecraft, or something like that, not games that a decade ago or something like that.
I mean, the examples you mentioned are obviously those that kind of have an advantage in terms of being visible, I would say. If we think about entertainment products, and that is not just in the game section, but also in other entertainment like movies, it's just, they're just very present, right? They're very visual. They're not just very visual, but they kind of attract all our senses auditively, visually. So I would not directly compare that in terms of what's a trend, what is not a trend. It's two very different fields where to apply them when you play in your spare time. Especially as a kid who maybe gets this sort of serve to improve a skill, it's something where it's not necessarily do in your spare, except you do, obviously, you're not doing it while you're sitting in school or something, but it's something where you kind of know you have to figure something out, and that I don't see a decline of a trend necessarily. I think it's something people talk about. As said, in the startup space, there's actually a bunch of people who ask me if I do educational games when I tell them I'm a game designer. And I'm almost sick of the question, because now, I don't know, but it's those kind of people who, well, try to solve other kinds of problems. I like to design games because I engaged with them in my spare time so much when I was a kid, and also do now, obviously. And on the other hand, there's those people who like to solve the problems of our time, and learning is obviously one of them. It will always be one of them, I'm assuming. And, well, then you approach the product from a different perspective, but I don't think, I would not compare the markets. That's ultimately what I'm after. And so I'd say, I think there will be a rise, but I also think there was not necessarily a decline. I think the attempt is, while it's novel, it's something that we've heard a lot of, like that we want to gamify something, that we want to make learning easier, especially with the term gamification becoming more present in the last years. Same principle. We want to add play to something that it's apparently you're hard to beat to get to do that thing, right? Go to do your run finally, right? Go be active, or what it is. I just see it in general getting more and more, and I think it already got more and more in the past years, but it's just not as present as Fortnite. I mean, if you've seen the talk today about the emotional moments, maybe?
Yeah.
Yeah? I mean, their job is to be in people's heads, right? They're doing this big epic event where everybody wants to participate, and they market on this. Educational games are just not doing it, therefore they seem small next to it. But yeah, I think it's very different markets.
Okay, I guess that's all for today. Thank you, Florian. I pronounced
Thank you very much
name
for having
right?
me.